The fire was small, just a crackling sweep through an abandoned field on the edge of town where weeds had grown wild and memories had been buried deep. Firefighters thought it would be out in an hour, another routine call on a sweltering July afternoon. But when the smoke cleared and the ash settled like gray snow, something in the blackened earth stopped them cold. A twisted bicycle frame, its purple paint blistered and peeling. A scorched backpack with cartoon characters melted beyond recognition. And beneath them, cradled in the soil like sleeping children, two sets of tiny human bones, curled together as if still clinging to each other in their final moments. The discovery ripped open a wound this quiet town had tried desperately to seal for 8 long years. Because on a spring morning in 2004, two best friends had walked to school together, laughing and sharing secrets, and simply vanished into thin air. No screams, no struggles, no goodbyes, just empty desks and broken hearts. For nearly a decade, their families had lived in a purgatory of unanswered questions, clinging to hope that grew thinner with each passing season. And now, suddenly, the earth itself was speaking. But the answers it whispered were darker than anyone was prepared to hear. April 14, 2004 dawned crisp and bright in the small town of Millbrook, where everyone knew everyone and children still walked to school without fear. 13-year-old Emily Carter stood at her bedroom mirror, brushing her long brown hair while humming softly to herself. She was the quiet one, always lost in her art, sketching faces that lived only in her imagination. Her room was a gallery of dreams, drawings taped to every wall, capturing the beauty she saw in ordinary moments. Next door, 14-year-old Sarah Monroe was already bounding down her front steps, her signature red backpack bouncing with every stride. Sarah was Emily's opposite. Loud, fearless, protective. She had been Emily's self-appointed guardian since first grade, when she'd scared off bullies who teased Emily for being too quiet, too different. They met at the corner of Maple and 3rd, the same spot they'd claimed as their own for 7 years. Sarah was chattering excitedly about the school talent show auditions, trying to convince Emily to perform one of her poems. Emily just smiled and shook her head, but her eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that only comes from being truly understood. Mrs. Carter watched from her porch as the girls walked away, their voices carrying on the morning breeze. Emily turned back once to wave, her face bright with that crooked smile her mother loved so much. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that happens 1,000 times in a mother's life. But this one would freeze in her memory forever, polished smooth by years of desperate revisiting. At Millbrook Middle School, the day unfolded like any other. Emily sat in the back of her art class working on a charcoal portrait of an old woman's hands. Sarah dominated the lunch table with stories that made her friends laugh until they snorted milk. They were seen in the hallways between classes, Emily quiet and observant, Sarah animated and alive. But somewhere between the lunch bell and the final dismissal at 3:15, something shifted. The ordinary day cracked open and 2 young lives slipped through the fracture. Their last teacher, Mrs. Henderson, remembered Emily raising her hand to ask about the weekend homework assignment. The school secretary saw Sarah in the hallway, adjusting that red backpack that seemed too big for her small frame. And then, nothing. As if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving behind only silence and the terrible weight of not knowing. But what no one realized yet was that by the time that final school bell rang, Emily and Sarah were already gone, and their nightmare had only just begun. The panic didn't hit all at once. It crept in slowly like water seeping through cracks. At 3:30, when Emily didn't appear at her usual pickup spot, her mother assumed she'd stayed late for art club. At 4 so, when Sarah hadn't burst through the front door with her typical explosion of backpack and stories, her father figured she was walking Emily home, as she sometimes did. But by 5, when neither girl had called and both phones went straight to voicemail, the comfortable assumptions began to crumble. Mrs. Carter drove to the Monroe house, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The 2 mothers stood in Sarah's driveway, calling the girls' names into the gathering dusk, their voices growing more frantic with each unanswered cry. By 7 p.m., Millbrook's small police force was mobilizing. Officer Janet Mills, who had known both girls since they were toddlers, took the initial report with steady hands but worried eyes. She'd seen missing person cases before, usually runaways or custody disputes that resolved within hours. But something about this felt different. The search began immediately. Officers combed every inch of the school grounds with flashlights that carved desperate paths through the darkness. They checked the playground, the parking lot, the small patch of woods behind the gymnasium where kids sometimes went to skip class. The girls' scent trail, picked up by the county's bloodhounds, led from their last classroom to the edge of the school property, and then simply stopped, as if they had been lifted into thin air or swallowed by the earth itself. The school's security cameras had been offline for routine maintenance that day, a cruel stroke of timing that would haunt investigators for years. No footage, no digital witnesses, no electronic breadcrumbs to follow. Classmates were interviewed through the evening and into the night. Yes, they'd seen Emily and Sarah at lunch, sharing a bag of chips and whispering about something that made them giggle. No, nothing seemed wrong. No, they hadn't mentioned any plans to leave school early. But as dawn broke over Millbrook on April 15th, rumors began to sprout like poisonous weeds. Some whispered that the girls had been planning to run away. Hadn't Sarah seemed more rebellious lately? Others swore they'd seen a strange blue pickup truck circling the school that week, though no one could agree on the license plate or the driver's face. The town's comfortable illusion of safety shattered like glass. Parents who had never worried about their children walking alone suddenly couldn't let them out of sight. The school implemented new security measures. Volunteers organized search parties that scoured every field, every abandoned building, every forgotten corner where two young girls might be hiding or held. And as the hours stretched into days, one terrible truth became clear. Emily Carter and Sarah Monroe hadn't just disappeared. They had vanished so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. Days bled into weeks with the relentless cruelty of time that refuses to stop, even when the world feels like it should. Millbrook transformed into a town of flyers and volunteers. Emily and Sarah's faces stared out from every telephone pole, every storefront window, every car bumper, missing stamped in red letters above their school photos. Emily with her shy smile and paint-stained fingers, Sarah with that mischievous grin that promised adventure. The FBI arrived in their unmarked cars and serious suits, setting up a command center in the school gymnasium. Agent Rebecca Stone, a specialist in child abductions, worked 18-hour days following leads that seemed to evaporate the moment she got close. Every tip was pursued with desperate thoroughness. A gas station attendant thought he'd seen two girls matching their description buying candy 2 towns over. A truck driver reported picking up hitchhikers who might have been them. A school custodian mentioned seeing them near the maintenance shed, but when pressed couldn't remember which day or what they'd been doing. The river was dragged 3 times. Search dogs followed phantom scents through miles of forest. Psychics called with visions that led nowhere but deeper into the labyrinth of false hope. As weeks turned to months, the investigation began to turn inward, examining the uglier possibilities that no one wanted to consider. Teachers were questioned about any inappropriate interactions. Family members submitted to polygraph tests. The girls' computers were forensically examined, their journals read line by line, their friendships dissected for any hint of danger. But Emily and Sarah remained maddeningly normal in death as they had been in life. No secret boyfriends, no online predators, no family dysfunction, no enemies. They were just 2 ordinary girls who had loved art and laughter and each other, and who had somehow stepped out of existence on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Their bedrooms became shrines. Mrs. Carter would sit on Emily's unmade bed, holding her daughter's favorite sketchbook and talking softly to the empty room. She told Emily about her day, about the flowers blooming in the garden, about how much she missed hearing that gentle humming from behind the closed door. The Monroe house grew quiet in a different way. Sarah's absence left a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Her father would find himself listening for the sound of her backpack hitting the floor, for her voice calling, "I'm home," up the stairs. The community, united at first by shared determination, began to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. Some blamed the school for inadequate security. Others questioned the police response time. Whispers started about which families were cooperating fully with the investigation and which seemed to be hiding something. By the 2nd anniversary, the vigils had grown smaller. By the fourth, they were attended mostly by family and the most loyal friends. The reward fund, once flush with donations, slowly dwindled as other tragedies claimed the town's attention. The case files were moved from active investigation to cold case storage, 3 bankers' boxes labeled simply Carter Monroe, Missing Persons. Detective Mills would sometimes pull them out on quiet nights, spreading the photos and reports across her desk, searching for the detail she might have missed, the connection she might have overlooked. But the earth kept its secrets, and time kept moving forward, carrying the town further away from that terrible April morning when 2 best friends had walked into their last normal day. Until 8 years later, when a small fire in an abandoned field would finally force the ground to give up what it had been hiding, and reveal that sometimes the truth is buried so close to home that we walk past it every day without knowing. July 28, 2012. The summer had been brutal, turning lawns brown and making the air shimmer with heat that seemed to press down on Millbrook like a heavy hand. The field behind Watson's old farm had been abandoned for years, a tangle of wild grass and volunteer trees that nobody bothered to tend. Kids sometimes rode their bikes there, and teenagers used it as a place to drink beer and tell lies about their romantic conquests. Nobody paid much attention to the old wooden shed that sagged in the middle of the field like a broken promise. It had been there so long that it seemed part of the landscape, weathered gray, half hidden by brambles, forgotten by everyone except the mice that had made it their home. The fire started small, probably from a carelessly thrown cigarette or a piece of broken glass focusing the sun's rays like a magnifying glass. By the time someone noticed the smoke curling up into the still air, flames were already licking at the dry grass with hungry tongues. Fire Chief Danny Morrison and his volunteer crew arrived expecting another routine brush fire, the kind they'd been fighting all summer as the drought stretched on. They had it contained within 2 hours, just another small victory against the relentless heat. But as the smoke cleared and the ash settled like gray snow, firefighter Tom Bradley was walking the perimeter, checking for hot spots that might reignite when the wind picked up. His boot hit something solid buried in the blackened earth. At first he thought it was just debris, maybe an old piece of farm equipment or construction waste, but as he brushed away the ash and char, his breath caught in his throat. A bicycle wheel, its spokes twisted by heat into abstract art. Purple paint, blistered and peeling, but still recognizable. Next to it, another bike, this one red, melted partially into the ground. Tom's hands were shaking as he called for Chief Morrison. The 2 men stood in the smoking ruins, staring at what the fire had revealed, neither wanting to say out loud what they were both thinking. Because buried beneath where the old shed had stood scattered among the twisted metal and melted plastic were fragments of backpacks, pieces of a cell phone case decorated with cartoon characters and a small digital watch with a pink band. And bones, small delicate bones that could only have belonged to children. Within an hour, the field was swarming with investigators. Yellow tape fluttered in the hot breeze like prayer flags. The state crime scene unit erected their white canvas shelter, transforming the burn site into a sterile temple of evidence and answers. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the medical examiner, worked with the careful precision of an archaeologist, brushing ash away from remains that had been hidden for 8 long years. Each bone was photographed, catalogued, treated with the reverence due to young lives cut short. As word spread through Millbrook, cars began arriving at the field's edge. Parents, reporters, curious onlookers, all drawn by the terrible magnetism of tragedy finally revealed. But it was the arrival of 2 specific cars that made everyone's breath catch. The Carters and the Monroes, called by police who had delivered the news with gentle voices and careful words, stood at the police tape holding each other up against the weight of what they were finally learning. After 8 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope, of imagining scenarios both terrible and miraculous, the earth was finally speaking. But as investigators began to piece together what the fire had revealed, they realized that finding Emily and Sarah was only the beginning, because now they had to discover how 2 young girls had ended up buried beneath an abandoned shed, and who had put them there. The forensic work took weeks, each day revealing another piece of the terrible puzzle that had been scattered and buried for 8 years. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains belonged to Emily Carter and Sarah Monroe. The bones told a story of young lives ended far too soon, but they also told investigators something crucial. The girls had died within hours of their disappearance, not months or years later, as some had hoped. Dr. Hernandez worked with the painstaking care of someone who understood she was handling more than evidence. She was handling the last physical connection between families and their lost children. Soil samples from around the remains revealed traces of chloroform, suggesting the girls had been rendered unconscious. Their personal effects, remarkably preserved in the airless environment beneath the collapsed shed, painted a picture of an ordinary school day interrupted by unthinkable violence. Emily's sketchbook was found, its pages filled with her characteristic portraits of imagined faces. Sarah's red backpack still contained her lunch money, carefully counted out in quarters and dimes, and a folded note from Emily that simply said, "You're the best friend ever, even when you're annoying." But it was the shed itself that provided the most chilling evidence. Forensic analysis revealed that the structure had been modified sometime around the girls' disappearance. Fresh nails had been hammered into the doorframe. A new padlock had been installed, one that could only be opened from the outside. Detective Stone, who had never forgotten the case despite being reassigned years earlier, flew back to Millbrook to review the evidence. The FBI lab had recovered fragments of duct tape from the scene, along with DNA evidence that had somehow survived 8 years in the ground. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the state's cold case DNA database. A sample from a cigarette butt found near the shed in 2004, dismissed at the time as unrelated litter, suddenly had a match. Marcus Holloway, 52 years old, a former janitor at Millbrook Middle School who had been dismissed 3 weeks before the girls' disappearance for what the school administration had diplomatically called inappropriate interactions with students. Holloway had left town immediately after losing his job, citing a sick relative in another state. He'd lived quietly under an assumed name in a small apartment complex outside Phoenix, working cash jobs and staying off the radar for 8 years. When FBI agents knocked on his door on a sweltering September morning, Marcus Holloway seemed to age 10 years in the space of a breath. His face went pale, his hands started to shake, and he asked the question that convicted him before he ever saw the inside of a courtroom. "Is this about those girls from the school?" The interrogation lasted 14 hours. Holloway's lawyer advised him to stay silent, but the weight of 8 years seemed to crush whatever resistance he might have had. The confession, when it came, was delivered in a monotone voice that made the horrible details sound even more surreal. He had been angry about losing his job, he said. Angry at the school, angry at the world, angry at the children who seemed to have everything he'd never had. When he saw Emily and Sarah walking near the maintenance area during lunch, something inside him snapped. He had lured them to the shed with a story about finding injured puppies. Once inside, he had overpowered them with chloroform-soaked rags, then locked them inside what he claimed was meant to be just a scare, revenge against the school that had fired him. But as Holloway's confession continued, his story began to change, to shift, to reveal layers of cruelty that went beyond momentary anger. And the most chilling detail of all was still to come. Because what Marcus Holloway said next would haunt everyone in that interrogation room for the rest of their lives. Marcus Holloway sat in the sterile interrogation room, his voice barely above a whisper as he delivered the final, devastating details of his confession. He claimed he had returned to the shed the next morning, planning to release Emily and Sarah with a warning to keep quiet about what had happened. But when he unlocked the padlock and pulled open the heavy wooden door, he found only silence. The medical examiner's report would later confirm what Holloway insisted he had discovered that terrible morning 8 years ago. The girls had died during the night, likely from dehydration and heat exhaustion in the airless, locked shed. Their final hours had been spent in darkness and terror, two best friends clinging to each other as hope slowly slipped away. In his panic, Holloway had made the decision that transformed a moment of rage into 8 years of lies. He had buried their bodies and their bicycles beneath the shed floor, weighted down with concrete blocks and covered with dirt. He had scattered their personal belongings, keeping some as grotesque trophies that investigators would later find hidden in his Phoenix apartment. For 8 years, Marcus Holloway had lived with the knowledge of what lay beneath that rotting shed, while 2 families slowly died a little more each day from not knowing. The trial, when it finally came, lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day with Millbrook residents who needed to see justice served, to witness the end of a story that had haunted their community for nearly a decade. Holloway was convicted of 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 25 years in prison. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. A period at the end of a sentence that had been hanging incomplete for far too long. But for the families, there was no victory in the courtroom, only a terrible kind of relief. Emily and Sarah could finally be laid to rest in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Millbrook, their headstones side by side beneath an old oak tree where butterflies gathered in the summer months. The funerals were held on a crisp October day, 8 years and 6 months after 2 girls had walked to school and never came home. The entire town seemed to attend, a river of black clothing and quiet tears flowing through streets that had been marked by loss for so long that grief had become part of the landscape. Mrs. Carter placed Emily's last sketchbook on her casket, the one found in the shed, its pages still filled with dreams and beauty, despite the darkness that had surrounded it. Mrs. Monroe tucked a photo of the girls into Sarah's small hands, the 2 of them laughing at Emily's 13th birthday party, their faces bright with the kind of joy that had defined their friendship. Millbrook Middle School built a small memorial garden where Emily and Sarah used to sit during lunch, sharing secrets and dreams beneath the flowering dogwood trees. A bronze plaque bears their names and the simple inscription, "Best friends forever, loved and remembered always." Every April 14th, their classmates return, adults now with children of their own. They bring flowers and photographs, stories of the women Emily and Sarah might have become. The artist and the protector, forever 13 and 14, forever walking to school together on a spring morning when the world still seemed safe. The town learned to carry its grief differently after the truth was finally revealed, not as a question mark that grew heavier each year, but as a period of remembrance for 2 young lives that had touched more people than they ever knew. Marcus Holloway remains in prison, eligible for parole in 2029. He has never received visitors. He has never expressed remorse beyond the mechanical recitation of his crimes. Some say that is fitting, that a man who could lock 2 children in a shed and walk away does not deserve forgiveness. But on quiet nights in Millbrook, when the wind moves through the memorial garden and sets the dogwood leaves to whispering, people swear they can still hear echoes of laughter. 2 voices, forever young, forever friends, reminding a small town that even in the darkest places love endures. Because Emily Carter and Sarah Monroe didn't just disappear on that April morning in 2004. They became part of Millbrook's soul, a reminder that some bonds are too strong for death to break and that sometimes the truth doesn't set us free. It just teaches us how to grieve.